Hello, welcome to the first tabletop session decompression video. It's a little series I thought of doing after I play a game or have something to talk about related to my hobby, which is tabletop RPGs, D&D, Pathfinder, especially as of today. This is the second edition of Pathfinder. This is what I want to talk about today. So I had a session this morning with a group of people meant to be an introduction to Pathfinder 2nd edition. So Pathfinder, as probably anybody seeing this will know, is it's essentially a 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons remade, and the 2nd edition of Pathfinder just takes that one step beyond. So just to give you my background as to where I'm at, I've been a DM for a very long time, a large number of years on and off as time goes on and permits. I've been a player a lot less, but recently, as we're getting into nicer weather, I'm getting back into the hobby, but I don't have, a permanent large kind of group to deal with right now. I thought, why don't I start filling that time by running games online, meeting new people, and of course, playing. One of the newest pieces of advice I've heard from lots of videos and that I watch, blogs that I read, that sort of thing, is, you really should be playing the game as a DM to get better as a DM, which makes sense. It's not just the system, but just the flow of how things feel. And Pathfinder 2nd edition is a huge leap from where I've been at in the past. I'm used to the old school D&D. AD&D 2nd edition was my kind of go-to. Dungeon Crawl Classics is what we played last year. Now, I don't consider that rules light by any stretch, but it just has that core philosophy behind it of narration first and gonzo kind of mechanics to keep the game random and interesting and dangerous. A real dangerous setting to play in, depending on how you run it. I've played a bit of 5e, not a whole lot, but I got interested in Pathfinder for a couple of reasons. One, I got interested in Starfinder. On Starfinder, I learned after picking up the rule book and reading it and running a couple of sessions, it was kind of like an in-between 1e and 2e, even though it's its own thing completely. So I had some assumption that it was going to be representative of what 2e was, and because I liked what I saw in Starfinder, that moved me towards 2nd edition to see what that was all about. Now, my experience today with Pathfinder was positive. It was a 4-hour session. It was all new people. The first hour was almost a session zero, getting everybody kind of up to speed on the software. We were using Foundry, which is a virtual tabletop, similar in the vein to Roll20 and things like that. A little flashier, a lot more robust, it seems, in some ways, or modern looking. I don't know how to explain it, but it was a really, really nice experience. So shout out to the people that maintain and run Foundry. That is a really, really killer piece of software. To make my own character, I used the Path Builder app on my Google phone, whatever, Samsung. And I had a character made in minutes, right? And then I was able to send that link to the GM, and he was able to import that into Foundry, and I had my own Pathfinder-themed character sheet, and I could press buttons on there to attack and things like that. It was really cool stuff. As far as the adventure itself goes, I don't know if it was something that he had made up or something he'd bought prior. Kind of meh. Like, it was a beginner's thing, so I think it's more, let's get everybody used to the mechanics and what you can do and how the game works. So that's fine. It didn't have like a conclusion. It just sort of ended. And it's not the way I would choose to introduce a game like this. I would do it very differently. I would have because it's not just about the mechanics at a certain point. It's also, what do these games feel like? And if this is my first impression of the game, and I didn't really know what D&D was, and I was brand new to all of it, and, to their credit, I think they assume people were not, and that's fine. Most of us were either DMs or players of other systems. I would not be using an adventure like the one we used. It's so immemorable, I can barely tell you what happened except for some of the encounters. But that was really, disappointing for me. And then the last encounter we ran was so long and so drawn out, and it was against one enemy that obviously had like 60 HP, and everybody was missing their rolls every round. It just became one of those slogs. As a DM myself, I would have found a way to end things far more quickly. I would have done something to mix it up so it didn't end up like that. And then we had a character, he fell into the dying state. And this is where I'm going to get into Pathfinder itself. Let's talk about Pathfinder 2e. Let's talk about this 600-page, 600-pound tome of information. It's a massive, massive tool set on things, for almost all aspects of the game. I think the only thing missing from here is like basic monsters. You get that in the bestiary. Of course, this is split into several books. I also have the Advanced Player's Guide. Now, my favorite thing, I'll just say right away, going into Pathfinder, is the amount of options for character creation. That paired with the Advanced Player's Guide, the amount of classes and races and archetypes, all these ways that are kind of allowing you to mix up what your characters can do. You've got backgrounds, similar to Starfinder as well, where it's like you don't just have a class and a race, you have sort of like a background of what your professional life was like before, and that influences what your character is like now. And then you can do archetypes, which is kind of like multi-classing, and it's just, mind-boggling the amount of stuff you can do as a player, right? And that's really, really cool. So that's a huge positive for me. Just the fact that there's so much in here. There's so many tools for things you can do. There's like 50 conditions, different conditions that can happen to you, like poison and stuff like that. But there's, that's almost like excessive. And this is where it brings me to, I guess, my criticisms of Pathfinder or any major RPGs. Once you get to this level of density, I'm always worried that the DMs or the GMs are going to be afraid to toss the bathwater out, right? Afraid to toss the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of a lot of the fat and a lot of the junk that is kind of in here. One of the things I hate about 2E so far is the dying system. It's like, you get wounded and then you will be unconscious and then you're dying and then you get 4 points towards dying. And if you pass a save, which is, a D20 or a DC 10 plus the number of dying that you are. If you're 2 or 3 or 4 dying, you don't pass that, you'll gain another dying point. And if you do pass that roll, then you'll lose one. It's just like super convoluted. Just die. Just your player's dead or they're unconscious. How hard is that to adjudicate, right? And I think that's as a DM that loves adjudication, that likes to improvise and is used to simple systems, I'm not afraid about reading a book like this. In fact, I love reading books like this. I love Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's huge. I love the old D&D books. They're insanely verbose to the point of stupidity and lack of clarity. But I love having a tool like this at my disposal that I can just poke, have a coffee, have a beer, whatever, and to just sit and read this and have ideas of more things I can add to my game. But I also don't like being beholden to the text where I feel like I'm not able to run or play this game until I have read this thing back to cover and remember every condition in the game and remember how every class is built and works. It's not that I don't want to be prepared, but I want to spend that time prepping for the game itself, for the adventure. So I feel like a game like Pathfinder has a large potential to take the GMs and the players out of the act of playing and enjoying the story and focusing on the mechanics. And that is no more clear than in the way that exploration in this is treated like you would treat a tabletop combat, in a sense where, at least this is my impression of it so far, where I now have to sort of move my piece across the board in squares. Like we're sort of taking turns doing exploration things. It gamifies the exploration process, whereas I like to generalize that part. That's the boring part in many games. It's different to say, okay, there's 3 rooms, which one do you want to go to? But I don't want to have a hall and then watch the players move their pieces down the hall. And this is quite literally verbatim how our game was going. And they were trying to stick to the rules as written play. That's a problem for me. And it's a taste thing, right? But I really don't like that. I just want to get you moving. I want to say, okay, you guys defeat the things in the room. We're moving on. There's a hall there and a room there. What do you want to do? And the players say, well, let's go down the hall there. Okay, you go down the hall. And, that's so much faster than, okay, take 10 feet and then move another 5 feet. It just, it's too much. That's too much for me, both as a GM and as a player. I love 3 actions. The fact that you get 3 actions, you get 3 things to do at a turn. That's really nice. HP and everything else, AC, all comes up as a result of this, right? It's kind of taking this short, brutal experience of like, I hit a guy, blah, his head explodes, he dies. Or he hits me, blah, he stabs me, I'm dead. And it bloats everything out to be bigger, larger than life. And I could see this being, quite honestly, a nightmare to play in higher levels if you didn't cut the fat. And the way that I read the rules, it certainly doesn't discourage that kind of thing. Like it's the same as any other RPG book where it kind of says, at the end of the day, you're the GM, you're the DM, you're the guy. You're the guy that makes up all this stuff at the end of the day. If you see things you don't want in your game, toss them out. But then there's so many things that, because the character building is so huge and so complex, I could see you like making a character specifically for exploration or something like that, right? And then I come along as a DM and it's like, blah, 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 we're just going to pass that part. Well, now some of your character's strengths are missing. Oh, man. So I can see this being like a nightmare to kind of house rule. And I would house rule a lot of this. But I love the material here. I love the art. It's not really a review of the book, but just my first experience playing the game. And it was a good one. That last hour dragged on and on and on for pretty, non-eventful encounters, what it felt like. I'm excited to play again. I have another game this Friday. I had 2 Pathfinder games this last week, and the other one was also quite slow, as I expected. I imagine a lot of them are going to be that way. But I'm excited to see, most of all, as a DM, can I run Pathfinder 2nd Edition in a way that's fast-paced, that's interesting, that we can kind of gloss over some of this stuff? And what are players' reactions going to be to that? I don't know. You can get away with that in other systems. I've gotten away with it in OSR systems because the people that play those games, they expect that kind of glossing over, or just kind of obfuscating these larger things and just distilling everything down to a couple of numbers and a couple of base rolls, and then you're good. It's like simplifying the beast, while still having lots of options in there. So my initial impressions of Pathfinder 2nd Edition was it's a good game. It's a very modern game. There are a lot of interesting flourishes and things. I like hero points, where you can get a point if you do something cool, and you can later use that to, retry a combat roll or a DC check or whatever it is. Lots of good stuff here. Overwhelming. Hugely overwhelming. And running games, I'm nervous about. And I will be running games at some point. But I'm nervous about the verbosity of it and about the general player base and maybe their expectation that it will be slow paced, that it will be very structured. I'd be afraid to deviate too far out of that. I certainly wouldn't do this theater of the mind, at least not for the combat parts anyways. But yeah, those are my thoughts. This is, again, the first episode of, I don't know, maybe the only episode. Me just talking as a GM and as a new player about some of the games that I enjoy. So thank you for watching. I hope you've gotten something out of this. Take care.